Time to get started, everybody. Welcome. I'm Kira Epstein. I'm the program coordinator at the New School at Commonweal. And today we have a special treat. We began a new series of conversations that explores the healing circle, and particularly the lineage of healing circles that we use at Commonweal. This is a 5-part series that features conversations with lineage holders like Michael Lerner, Parker Palmer, and in today's conversation, Diana Lindsay, Christina Baldwin, and Ann Linnea. Diana is the co-director of Commonweal's Healing Circles Global Program, and we are so pleased to co-present this conversation with her and the whole network of volunteers at Healing Circles Global. You can find out more about the rest of the events in this series, as well as all of our events and event recordings, on our website at tns.commonweal.org. You can also find and subscribe on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Ken Adams and Daron Hovav are behind the scenes today, helping us with production, so thanks to both of you. And now we're ready to begin. Diana Lindsay, Christina Baldwin, and Ann Linnea, welcome to the New School at Commonweal.
Thank you so much, Kira. Thank you, Daron and Ken, for bringing this. And thanks to all of you that are here. I see so many familiar faces from Healing Circles, from Commonweal, from the Circle Way, and those of you brand new to this. We welcome you. Here are some words from Ann and Christina that continue to inspire me. We have the opportunity in Circle to heal our old stories and to make new stories that lead to different actions and create a different world. This is the promise that Christina Baldwin and Ann Linnea, co-founders of the PeerSpirit and the Circle Way process, have brought to us at Healing Circles Global. As Kira said, this is the first of a 5-part series. It is our lone fundraiser of the year. Healing Circles Global is currently offering 1,500 service hours every month to people around the world. So anything you can offer is helpful, from $1 to more. Please donate if you can to the link in the chat box. Christina and Ann, we are good friends. We live not so far away from each other. But I'd like to let our audience know you a little bit better. So I know that Ann says, keep it brief, but you're accomplished women who I want to be sure everybody can understand the breadth of. Christina, you're a writer, a wanderer, a teacher on the trail of community and story. And you're also an author, and I know that you're right in the middle of yet another book, your first work of fiction. So we're looking forward to that. You were an early pioneer in the work of journaling as a way of understanding the self as source, which is the name of the workshops that you offer. Life's Companion, journal writing as a spiritual practice, had thousands of copies, 100,000 copies before it got a second edition. Story Catcher, making sense of our lives through the power and practice of story, was really inspirational to me. Calling the Circle, the 7 Whispers, spiritual practice for times like these. There's one chapter we'll get to the end that is actually the mantra we repeat frequently at Healing Circles Global. And with Ann, you wrote The Circle Way, a leader in every chair, which you can see mine is well post-it marked and highlighted. And you came from a different background into this, an inspiring story of the relationship between human beings and nature. You wrote the award-winning Teaching Kids to Love the Earth. And then this story just continues to blow me away. In 1992, you were the first woman to circumnavigate Lake Superior by sea kayak. And you wrote Deep Water Passage, a deeply moving book out of that experience. You've written The Keepers of Trees, a guide to regreening North America. And I know that this is a continued passion of yours. So welcome to this. Thank you so much for giving us your time. And let's just jump in. Christina, in our training, we have another quote of yours that we use in every single training. It says, "Circle started around the cook fires of humanity's ancestors and has accompanied us ever since. We remember this space. When we listen, we speak more thoughtfully. We lean into shared purpose." Can you talk about the origins of Circle? Why Circle for you?
Well, I think that feels to me like a pan-cultural or a first culture. And Ann and I began researching this in the early 90s when we met. And Ann wanted to bring some of her burned out social activist, environmental activists indoors into a way to build a reflective practice. And I wanted to get some of the journal writing people I'd been working with outdoors into activities. So our very first seminar was called Women and the Planet, Returning the Gift. And as that began to work and we called people into Circle, we said, this is something. It's something more than a shape. It's an energetic field. And it was very difficult to actually research it. But we began diving back into anthropology, and especially with Ann and her literal history with campfires. Then we went, where are the campfire rings of humanity? And there are old fire rings that show up in North Africa and the Middle East that are 160,000 years old. So it became obvious to us that people have come to the fire, and that circle is really the social DNA of our species.
Yeah, thank you. Indigenous to all of us, really, our
Yeah.
common heritage. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in that same breath, Diana, we also honor the current day Indigenous people who
Mm-hmm.
have carried that form forward so that many of us who lost it in our particular race could recover it. So I want to speak that honoring.
Thank you very much, Ann. Intention is one key part of everything that you do. And you just shared, Christina, some of the first intentions behind those first workshops.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think became the intention of PeerSpirit and ultimately the Circle Way out of the work that you did?
I think what became the intention of our work was to help people remember how to do this and to train people to hold dedicated space. A lot of modern conversational space is not held socially. It's kind of drive-by conversation. Now we have texting and twitting and all of this other kind of stuff. It's not really held. And Circle reminds us that when we sit down with one another, and especially if we put a purpose in the space between us, in the center between us, that it creates a whole different dynamic. So a lot of our work was to train people to do this and to help people remember how to do it. And then people started doing this, and Healing Circles Langley and now Healing Circles Global is a huge part of the lineage that has come off of our life work. We work deeply in education, in women's religious communities, and in hospital administrative settings. And now through the circleway.net, it's just really going global in a whole other way.
I think to follow up with what Christina is saying, I appreciate your question, Diana, because the other most basic intentionality behind working in Circle is a belief that there is a leader in each and every chair gathered in the circle, and that honestly, as a group, we will be wiser. Our decisions will be better if we hear the voices of everyone.
Right.
That has been so profound to me, that idea of the leader in every chair. You started that with the idea of, you called it changing the triangle into a circle, changing hierarchy into a group, collective, collaborative endeavor. Can you talk more about how that worked for you? You mentioned the organizations, the education, and the nurses. I know you did a lot of work in organizations.
Well, I think that we talk a lot about using a talking piece sometimes in circle where you pass something hand to hand, but it should really be called a listening piece. Because when one person is talking, the rest of the room, or the rest of the circle is listening. And I think it is the act of listening that creates leadership in every chair, to know that you have a chance to say your piece, to address whatever perspective you're bringing to the purpose of the meeting. And that's what transformed a lot of the teams we worked with in organizations, is that the traditional leadership, the CEO or the project manager, whatever, ended up listening to his or her team and then going, wow, this is a much more interesting way of doing it. And I feel much more educated.
And the other part of that is, we're not saying that the circle should replace hierarchy. There are times, particularly, I mean, I can give an excellent example in 911 situations. Mm-hmm. You want a chain of command. You want people to really respond by their job position, or you have chaos. But circle works really well with hierarchy in every single situation that we have been privileged to be a part of. Is one without the other denies our basic human goodness and wisdom, and makes any organization less, in my feeling.
Can you give us an example of an organization where this delicate dance between equality of voice and hierarchy?
Well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, the religious orders of women that we were really privileged to work with over the decades. I mean, if you think about a hierarchical organization, the Catholic Church comes right to mind, right? And the Catholic sisters themselves have definitely a hierarchical organization. But they realize that in order for the provincial, which is usually the head of their particular organization, to work well, she can't work in isolation. You know, needing to hear the voices not only of those who are directly below her in responsibility, but all of the women that she's serving. So that example comes to mind.
Did you have one, Christina?
Well, I was actually thinking of the same thing. Our newsletter that went out this morning featured some of the lessons from the Franciscan sisters that we worked with over the years. And as they began to get smaller in number, they said, you know, it doesn't make sense to have a leadership council that's trying to, you know, organize 20 remaining active sisters. So it's like, we need to become a council in which we are all leaders, and to go, there's a facility then to go back and forth between, I need to make a decision and I need to listen to the community before I make that decision. And I think that kind of Mobius strip is the real transformation that leaders, it's not lonely at the top. It shouldn't be lonely at the top. You should always have a council around you. And when you look into indigenous village or tribal structure, there was a council of chiefs. There was a medicine society there, you know, that there were always groups of people who took responsibility for governance. And I love that even in the United States government now, you have a working cabinet and a president who says to the vice president, I want you to be the last one in the room. A very collaborative sense of governance.
Yeah, and since we both took an example of women religious, I'll just step back. I think two other places that we had an opportunity to work a lot with were healthcare settings and higher educational settings. And the circle as a leadership form works best when there is a leader who does not hold things tight to the chest in terms of control, is the leader who Actually, the circle
Transparent.
won't work in an organization unless the leader genuinely believes that he or she will gain wisdom from those beneath.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've heard you talk about circle being the universal pattern, and you set out to identify those patterns and make them universal again in all of these different kinds of environments. And I know you had very specific patterns within the circle that you identified and taught. And I'd like to begin, Christina, you mentioned the center just a little bit ago, with the role of the center and the role of the host, because that's another terminology used that's been important to us. What's the role of the center and the role of the host in the circle?
Well, as I said, when Ann and I started this in the early 90s, I mean, we were such pioneers. We were trying, it was like a fish trying to examine water. You know, what are the elements of water that keep me alive? And in looking at the circle and looking at the campfire, we thought there has always been something in the center traditionally. And it was the fire, the cook fire, the campfire, the council fire. And so we've used that language, but also then talked about the shared purpose of the group. Why are we together? And whether it's a family reunion celebrating
a birthday
or something, or whether it's a team in an organization, understanding why we're together becomes like this focal point that calls people then to speak to what's happening with relevance and brevity and focus. And it becomes like the center of a bicycle wheel in which everyone else's participation is linked to that core sense of what's in the middle. And it also then allows us to put very diverse opinions, even emotionally different opinions, to that fire instead of across the circle from my chest to your chest. You know, and so it's not that everyone has to agree, but everyone can lean in and look.
Yeah, I think the point that I would add here is structure is important. No, circle is not a leaderless form. There are many roles of leadership on the circle, around the circle, and those rotate. Whether it is the host who takes the time to organize things, whether it's the guardian who is watching the energy of the form, and the role of the center is critical. I think, particularly when we went into places of business that might be a little more suspicious of a soft form, the fact that we had language for structure was very reassuring to people. And especially because the center is the resting place of why are we here? So when conversations wander in any number of directions, which they do because we're human beings, it's easy for the host to bring it back and remind people of why we're here at this meeting. And if perhaps that conversation doesn't fit, it should be used in another circle gathering. So it was really important to us to bring enough structure into the form of circle that it could exist in modern culture.
And we use the word host instead of facilitator because the host and the guardian, and I know you're going to ask a question about that in a minute too, but the host and the guardian then are like point holders, but they're within the group process. They're not wandering around at the edge. They're not overseeing it. They're participating in it. But the role of the host is to stay cognizant of that center point, of the purpose, while just lightly, somebody said, spicing the conversation with structure. You know, what is the lightest possible structure we need to make sure this works?
And I know that idea you just mentioned of the host participating is really quite different than a therapeutic model where the therapist needs to maintain a professional distance. Here, everybody is in and equally vulnerable.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you mentioned the word guardian, and I think that is one of the key roles for us when we started Healing Circles Langley. When we heard of the guardian and experienced you as a guardian, we said, this will be safe enough for a volunteer organization to hold. Can you tell me about how you see the role of the guardian?
Well, the role of the guardian is a radical and ancient role. Somebody who is a part of things, but is a little bit stepped back and listening with the big ear. And in most modern meetings, there is oftentimes a competition for, how can I get my voice on the floor? And the guardian, every time I'm a guardian, I learn something new about listening and observing. And we give in the circle way a sound to the guardian, whether that be a bell or a rattle, something that is different than the human voice that can call a pause into the meeting as a whole. And I use the word radical because in many of the traditional settings that we were in, whether it was higher education or nursing or a group of doctors, it's like, what? You're going to ring a bell? I'm not comfortable with that. But it introduces a pause, a way to get people to sit back in their seat and take a breath and listen to what is going on. Now, the guardian may ring the bell and call for a pause, but the guardian may have been asked to ring the bell by somebody else in the circle. It's not that the guardian controls this introduction of the pause and reflection.
Mhm.
I was just listening to a podcast that Krista Tippett was doing with Christine Runyon about just that pause, that's such a part of everything, of mindfulness, of breath, and how particularly in these times of the pandemic, that reset is vital to our sympathetic, the balance between our sympathetic and our parasympathetic systems.
Mhm.
And that without that, we get the overlaying of trauma.
Yeah.
So you instinctively had that. The other thing I think so profound about the guardian is to say, here is one person in the circle we are going to dedicate to the safety of the circle.
Right.
That protection of all circle members is so vital that we're going to dedicate a role to that. How did you come
Well,
up
I think that, it's trial and error, right? So when someone came to our very first training with the story of being in I think it was a men's group, and the third speaker took the talking piece and went on for 30 minutes. And the group just felt held captive in a way, and so there's everything. We thought, well, how could we prevent that, set it up rather than being in that position of not wanting necessarily to cut someone off, but feeling like, oh, what do I do? So the guardian role became obvious in its need very early on. And then Ann and I, as host and guardian, always sat across from each other so that we could each clearly see half of the circle, so that everyone was in the view of either the host or the guardian, and that we made it clear that every participant could just, say, I need a ding, please stop, so that there was that kind of rebalancing of power. And the guardian handles everything from, we're going to do a check-in. I'm going to invite us to do a 1 minute, like we did in the chat room at the beginning of this, a 1 minute little brief. Why are you here today? Or occasionally we would ask a question that turned into a very deep dive And one of the examples in the book is about asking a group of nurse administrators to tell us a story about the day they decided to be a nurse. And Ann and I, coming in from the outside, thought, well, this will be a nice little check-in. Well, it was a huge dive into personal history. And we just surrendered the morning to it and just said, this is the most important thing that can happen. And
with, again, the guardian making that observation and is this okay with everyone?
Just naming it and going for it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We've just been talking about the host and guardian, but the circle member, each circle member is vital to the success of the circle. It all doesn't rest on those two roles. And so you've had principles, you call them 3 principles. You've mentioned the rotating leadership. Your other 2 are sharing responsibility and a reliance on wholeness. What do you mean by that?
Well, reliance on wholeness is acknowledging that the fullness of every human being that is sitting in that circle is important to the fullness of things, not just their mental acuity, not just their physical needs, their spiritual perspective as well. And so it is an invitation for the circle to welcome the wholeness of who we are. Mm-hmm. And so in many ways, it's inviting spirituality into modern circles. And at some level, the guardian plays that role. That allows everyone to have that input.
The other aspect of that is that oftentimes there is a moment where the circle starts doing us instead of us doing the circle. And your beloved Kelly used to say there's the mechanical and then there's the magic. And the reliance on wholeness is really making space and welcome for that magic to happen, for the circle to start informing us why we're here. And to pay attention to that. And many times as that alchemy begins to really get stirred in a group, then the guardian role becomes very obvious because there's like a moment where somebody speaks it and the whole group kind of goes, and wants to pause and really take it in and listen to it. And so the reliance on wholeness is a delightful dive. And we are all sharing responsibility for getting there and for allowing that shift to happen. So.
Wholeness as the root of healing was an important idea. That's why Parker Palmer will be our next speaker, because his book, A Hidden Wholeness, just helped us see all of the dimensions that we all carry and the healing that is possible within us all. And that moment when we're aware of that is that magic. It happens, frankly, in almost every circle. But do you have any example of times where that magic really spoke to your hearts?
Ooh, I would say that the times that, it's difficult because circle is a confidential space too, but that there has been over and over again these spontaneous, often participant-led uprisings of ceremony. And I'm thinking of a time in a training of ours where there was a lot of grief in the group. And one of the women just took a basket, just a straw basket, and began passing it around and just inviting people to symbolically, silently, or with a few words to put their grief into the basket. And the basket made its way all the way around. And then another woman took a shawl and just lovingly wrapped it as though it was the most precious child, and held it on her lap, as you would hold a crying baby. And it's the kind of thing where you can never say, if you have grief in the group, do this.
Right.
It has to spontaneously arise out of that wholeness that's already there.
So the example, I'll just trust, this is the example that came to me, is you were probably not surprised. It's a nature example. So we were leading a kayaking trip in Greece, and we had an older Greek gentleman whose land we were camped on, who spoke no English. And the reason I want to speak this example is the energetics of circle transcend language. Mm-hmm. So he was there for our evening campfire. He ate with us, and one of our guides, of course, was Greek and translating all of this. And we did our evening check-in after a particularly challenging windy day of paddling. And so the talking piece went all the way around, and our Greek guide asked if Barbamitsos would like to speak. And so he took the piece and spoke in Greek. And I knew what he was saying. He was so pleased to be a part of this group, which included some children, and so pleased to be of help to the group. And it didn't matter that I didn't understand each word that he spoke. Energetically, I got it.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the energetics of circle in your training. And I experienced you as a very solid tree in the circle, giving and taking and giving of oxygen and the exchange of CO2. How has your experience of nature informed how you experience the energy of circle?
What an excellent question, Diana. Nature teaches us over and over again to be observant and to be spontaneous, because things are changing all the time. That is really the only constant in nature and in our lives. And that practice for me, over and over and over, every single day, I'm outside as much as I possibly can be. And that kind of observation and listening and awareness is something that I bring when I come indoors or when I'm sitting outside with people. I am a person who would rather listen than speak. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. You have 3 practices that you talk about: attentive listening, intentional speaking, and attending to the well-being of the circle. We talked a little bit about the intention behind the speaking, and you mentioned that talking piece would be better framed as a listening piece. But attending to the well-being of the circle, how we've had some examples of people who have done that, but how do you talk about that?
I think it streams off the principle of shared responsibility. Mm-hmm. That as you come to a circle and sit down and really get seated in yourself and centered in yourself and pay attention to what is the purpose of this group, then it invites me, while I'm sitting in the wholeness of my being, to make choices that what would contribute now. Mm-hmm. And we oftentimes have what we call a story council at some point in the training, where people are really invited to spend some time thinking about what would you like this particular group to know about you through story. And that upends a bucket of possibilities, and it then is a sorting process. For myself, I go, what would contribute here? Not only in terms of what I would like the group to witness, but also what I would like to extend into the shared experience. And certainly in the healing circle work that you are doing, this is the core of it, is how is story a healing process for the people who are contributing?
So I love the word practice because I believe we don't learn anything without practice. And anytime I am trying something new, I want to know what is the skill set that will help me do well in this form. And because circle is an unusual form for many in our modern culture, it sure helps me to know, okay, what are the skills that I might work on to be a better circle member? And the word practice is intentional. We're never perfect at it. we can, in a moment of passion in whatever we're speaking, forget that, oh, yes, we're supposed to be attending to the well-being of everyone here. Mm-hmm. And so to the best of our ability, we do that.
Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it such a beautiful life practice. Mm-hmm. I know I was just in a situation that wasn't so good. And I just kept saying over and over, what are our agreements? Right. So let's talk about that. The tool that helps keep that well-being of the circle, in addition to the guardian, are the agreements. Why did you give voice to what we often take for granted? We take for granted that there are common agreements, and you said, no, let's make them and let's give voice to them. Tell us about that.
I have a friend who is a writer, and many years ago she said, writing is like jumping on a bicycle and pedaling really fast, hoping it will materialize under you. And unspoken agreements are like that, that you jump into a group process and everybody starts talking and hoping that coherence will materialize under you. And we thought, for the circle to really be strong, we need to articulate that so that people know, like Ann was saying about practice, people know how to sit down and behave toward one another and have that sense of, I've got this. I can do this. I'm contributing. Wow, look, somebody really liked what I just said, that kind of thing. And without that, it can get chaotic really fast. Mm-hmm. So the agreements that we came up with, we have invited people to put into their own words, to reshape for the subculture of the group they're in. And I know that I've seen the agreements in the healing circles. You've done that beautifully. But to look at the common elements, and one common element is for the circle to be a healthy space, people need to understand what is confidential and what is shareable. And so we have the agreement about stories are confidential. And oftentimes information then needs to be shared, but that you get permission before you share stories. And that everyone will ask for what they need and offer what they can, just strengthens all the principles and practices that you've been talking about. And that we share responsibility for listening to one another with an open mind, with compassion and not judgment. And I always say that for me, that's just changing the voice in my head from what is she doing to what is she doing? And to raise it up to be curious instead of coming to conclusion. And then the fourth one is to introduce the guardian, to agree to pause, to agree to allow the guardian to have that kind of spiritual authority to stop all of us, including the host, and just say, let's take a breath.
So let me give a specific example. Yeah. I have the great joy of working with our local organic farm school right now. And we have 12 young people coming in next week, ranging in age from 21 to 45. And you might say, well, we know how to work together. You work hard, you move the transplants around. But it's that word assumption, Diana, that you use that is critical. If we make assumptions and people don't do what we're assuming, then we project all over them. So we will, in our first day together, spend an hour and a half generating agreements for how we will be together this next 9 months. And I don't, when I introduce that, give them examples, except for one. Assume good intent, which is a very, very important agreement for them, and language they may not use coming from a variety of backgrounds, but it opens up the conversation. Oh, assume good intent. Another one that comes forward is, let us ask someone if we are not clear what they have said. So I don't need to go into any more details, but agreements in a workplace or norms of operating, as is often called in big businesses, it's just part of daily life with good reason. We've learned it's an important thing with human beings.
You think that we could do that with our marriages, relationships between parents and children? You know, we make vows, but in our day-to-day, to make the agreements that we remember, that's beautiful. And Christina, you use the word curiosity, and research shows that every moment we're curious, we get a hit of dopamine.
Oh, good.
Not only gives us pleasure, but boosts our immune system. So and furthermore, in this pandemic, we've lost that. And so our thinking is becoming rigid, which is why we tend to have two sides and then we fight. So to have that ability to be curious about one another is actually the first step in our healing process. I'd like to come back to story because, Christina, you wrote a whole book. You call it Story Catcher, and you've called it a map of human experience. Can you tell us more about the role of story in Circle? I know from participating in your workshops, you dedicate a whole night to people's stories and give them time to reflect. We're in a 90-minute format.
Yeah.
But as you said, we have the opportunity to get to know and be and support each other week after week after week for as long as we want. So tell us more about story and its role.
Well, if language was a human body, story would be the spinal cord. That every language has this kind of narrative core to it. And until we had literacy and writing, most of human experience was passed along orally and embedded in story because people remember it. And so a lot of the scientific, nature-based wisdom of our long ancestral history actually comes down to us through story. And that when in English you begin something that says, once upon a time, it opens up the right brain. It opens up a part of our mind that listens differently. And we begin to track so that there's data and information and survival information that's embedded, but you tell it through story. And so even like with little children, you can say to them, don't touch the stove, it's hot. Or you can say to them, once there was a little duck who wandered into the kitchen and he touched the stove with his bill. And that's why the duck goes quack, quack, quack. Well, what is the little kid going to remember? Going to remember, ooh, I don't want to be like that duck, So it's a delightful, playful way to educate and inform one another. And it also creates empathy. So, this is the huge seeding for you in healing circles, is that one person brings a story and others lean in and relate to it and relate to that person through it. And it also is a way that people who are very different can discover commonality.
So one of the threads I want to pick up here. Once upon a time, many Augusts ago, a man and woman met Christina on the trail on the island and talked to Christina about this idea that they had for starting some kind of healing circles. And Christina explained that in 2 days, our circle training was starting. Perhaps you want to join. And Diana, you are so incredibly articulate about circle, and you have done phenomenal work. I am going to, as the panelist, ask a question of you because you're so articulate. I believe the participants here, who I wish we could see, will learn a lot listening to you. What are a couple of the silver threads of the Circle Way work, or maybe even the steel threads that have enabled you to build healing circles into a global movement in a relatively short time? So what are the steel threads of the Circle Way that really have enabled you to do that?
Well, simplicity has been key. Structure, we simplified it even more. The role of host and guardian, because we wanted to have a volunteer-based movement, because we wanted to sustain over time. We were moving away from the retreat center format into something that could support you no matter what happened in your day. Maybe it's the anniversary of your sister's death. Maybe someone dear to you just died. Maybe you've lost a pet, a good friend. Maybe you lost a job. Maybe you're anxious. We all cycle through all of this every day. And we all come from a very strong community where people do hug each other in grocery stores.
Right.
But there is a feeling that we live in this beautiful community. How could anything be wrong? And, I knew that wasn't true, that while we might have the smile and we might have the hug, that each of us had something in that moment they were working on. So we wanted to be able to provide that support over time. So it couldn't be professional based, couldn't involve money. So your ideas of the host and the guardian, I, as a volunteer, am not the great leader. I'm not the great therapist. I'm not responsible for taking anyone from here to there. I'm responsible for setting the space and welcoming it. That was such a profound idea. And the idea that the guardian would be with you always. You would always have a buddy. Yeah. And so maybe today you're not feeling so well. You can always turn. Can you host? As I did last week for the Global Circle of Hosts. I just turned to Susanna 10 minutes before the call. You know what? When I sense the energetics of my body, I'm not fully present. So I love that. And Kelly and I love the power of the agreements because we saw if we just set that out, that's really all we need. It's really all we need. We converted the leader in every chair to the healer in every chair. And
great.
So an important agreement is that we honor each other's paths to healing and don't presume to fix, save, or give advice. And that's a challenging one. That's our most challenging one. But it helps us take the responsibility for our own healing. And without that, we don't heal as thoroughly. I'll just say that. I want to tell another story that you said that leads us into the next place, because they're going to get a chance to hear me in a few weeks. So thank you, Ann, for sharing this responsibility. We have talked about how you set up a structure that organizations can use, but we were just alluding a few minutes ago to how this is a way of life. Mm-hmm. And you told me a story, Christina, of a tough year that the two of you had, and how you always carried a little candle in your purse. And I don't know if you carried a bell in your purse, but whenever the two of you felt like you needed to talk, you put it in the middle.
Yeah. I know, which tough year was that, but I know when we were raising Ann's children that she brought to our partnership, that we would Sunday morning, when the teenagers are sleeping in, we would go down on the beach, and we would, with the lovely debris the beach offers us, make this beautiful little mandala in the middle between us. And we would really talk to one another about how we were each coping and how the kids were and that kind of thing. And so it became kind of a weekly ritual. And a man who came to our circle work at that time said he went home and he asked his wife 3 questions. How are you? How are we? And how are we with God? Was his language, so so it could be translated however that works for you, but it's like really to check in from self to us, to the wholeness of who we are. And now we have these little LED candles that you can carry in your purse, or you can even in the grocery store, when you are done hugging and you say, how are you really? Sometimes I'll just stand with my hands cupped like this, and it's somatically signals I am receiving what you're saying. And I want to listen with my open hand, not just, hi, how are you? And move on.
Mm-hmm. So a structure to that piece of the two of us sitting in circle, before I address that, I am so glad you asked that question, because of course, circles can just be two people. You don't need 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. Is that because I am more introverted than Christina, which is probably pretty easy to see in this interview, in our format between the two of us, we would, if it was my turn to hold the talking piece, she would simply listen for 10 minutes, and we literally looked at our watches. So for me, a lot of silence would ensue, but it gave me an opportunity then to bring forward those pieces that were deeper inside of me, that there was space and there was time. So that again brings up a couple of points about circle. 1, it can just be 2 people. And 2, you really need to give people time and space to tap into what is happening inside of them.
Mm-hmm. Kelly and I took that story and made it a deep part of our marriage, which was if we were having any conversation where either the pace got too fast or there was a disagreement, before it got to a fight, we would just take whatever was at hand, which was usually a salt shaker, and just put it between us. And the minute the salt shaker went between us, that just meant, okay, go ahead. Talk as long as you want. When you're done, I'll talk as long as I want. How do we do? Do we need another round? Yep. Okay. Do it again.
Yeah.
Good.
I love the simplicity of that.
Yeah. And one of the important things is, in relationships, in family, and actually in places of work. I'm thinking again about the organic farm school next week, is if there is a structure for having a conversation that includes listening, it helps avoid drive-by comments. And drive-by comments, as all of us who are partnered or come from families or have friends know, can be not so helpful sometimes. And if the moment is such that the drive-by comment cannot be unpacked, having the tool of circle to say, I'd like to bring out the salt shaker tonight to just revisit that conversation or whatever your format is.
Another thing that we did in the trainings that I find really applicable in daily life is appreciation. And we would close the trainings with an appreciation council in which in various formats, people were really offered back how the group saw them and appreciated them. And we just had our grandchildren up here for the first time in a year and a half, and we had wonderful little check-ins every morning. But it wasn't until after they had left for the airport, I went, oh, it's just, we were out of practice and we didn't do an appreciation council with them. And there are so many appreciations that as their grandmothers, we really wanted to offer them in the container of listening. And it would have been very, I think, helpful to us to also hear their reflections back to us. So I just kind of noted that in myself and thought, oh, I don't want to forget that. I don't want that to slide away. And it's a great way to refresh relationships of any kind, to just pause and say, and what do I appreciate about you? Even when Ann's kids were here and we went through some of the sort of step family rockiness, we would give them a few days warning and say, before you go to your father's for Christmas, we're going to have an appreciation council. And so you have to think of something nice to say to us and each other, kind of, and it was helpful. Yeah. It was helpful in some of the rockiness of those years.
I'd like to just offer to everybody listening that I'm going to just ask Ann and Christina one more question, because obviously we could be here all afternoon, but we want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. So please put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A. And while everybody's doing that, Ann and Christina, you'll be back with us in our last webinar, which will be a panel, which will be so much fun to all be together. And we'll be looking forward, but I'd like to just give a taste of that from the distance. The power of story, the container of Circle Bay have fabulous transformative power. And I started the quote, this off with the quote where you talk about the power to talk the world we need into being. Where do you see Circle? How do you see it helping us in all the challenges that we're facing today?
Honestly, I cannot imagine us solving the challenges we have today without Circle. It's like Christina began by speaking. It was the most basic human form of gathering in groups. And we need it today more than ever.
And we need that center point. I think particularly, like you said, this last year of isolation, people have siloed what they believe. And now we need to listen to each other. And in the kind of bursting forth of family reunions and memorial services and weddings and all of that stuff that's been on hold for the last year and a half, to bring to those settings the lightest hosting and guardian of the moments, to give people a chance to say to one another, why did you come? I'm thinking of in both our families, there's quite a wide range of political and spiritual belief. And it is in sitting in circle and asking the question around, what sustains you about being in this family? allows people to do everything from testifying on one end to really speaking. I don't know what the other end of the spectrum is, but without charge, without feeling like we have to come to some kind of false unity, but to just listen to the range of heartfelt appreciation and connection that people feel. And to me right now, it's about listening our way back to one another and going to the places where we can extend a hand. And that's different for everybody.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with some questions. And Claudia Root is here from Cape Town. And she has been using this in trauma work and healing in the Cape Town area with lay people and communities so filled with generational and systemic violence. How do you think Circle can work in that context? And how would you approach hosting circles in that context?
Well, I'll start by blessing her.
Yeah.
That is an extraordinary undertaking. We have had the privilege of being in Cape Town. I think one of the most important things will be a very tight, loving structure. And only she and the local people will know what are a good set of agreements. But it could be as basic as there can be no violence or harm done to anyone in this circle. So I would just call Claudia to her deepest wisdom about her own local community.
And ceremony that's appropriate to the setting, Claudia, in terms of, when people are highly disturbed. I mean, there have been times that we have wrapped them in a blanket and with permission held them from behind to just help them stay in their body, to really look at the energetic practices that will keep people grounded. And I would hesitate to give advice about that from such a distance, but to really trust your own intuitive knowing in your community of how to help people stay grounded while they're revisiting trauma and not re-traumatize themselves in the process.
And who would be your local elder who could sit in that circle and provide comfort? Even if that elder didn't speak so much.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, because there's a question from Lena Kramer that is, how might gray heads host the containers for building bridges and understanding?
I think that's probably the question that all of us gray heads. Thank you, Lena. Of course you ask a wise question. Oh my, it's like finding the point of empowerment locally where one is needed, and finding the point of empowerment in our families. So my family is hoping to gather in June. My mom, the last of her generation, passed away in October. And of course, because of COVID, we were not able to celebrate her life, her 94-year-old life. And as we gather, my three sisters and I are the gray heads, and how we hold that container, everything from fun to really honoring Mom, is going to be up to us to step forward and take leadership, because people are coming from long distances because they want to honor this woman that they loved so deeply. And if we don't provide the container for collecting that, it will be an opportunity that was lost, really.
This is a question from Chris Camerata, who himself should be on this panel. Chris, next time. He's asking you if there's something you say to yourself, like a reminder to center yourself, or a silent prayer before you enter circle? If so, would you mind sharing it?
I can answer first. The question that I always ask in my moment of quiet, whether that's outside walking or just breathing, is how can I be of best service in this moment and this gathering?
Christina?
Well, I often ask to be used by the circle, by that wholeness, by the circle itself, that there is an intelligence and a heart that comes into this called space, and it slows us down. And I ask to be a good servant to the space itself. And, our rituals have evolved over the years, and now that we're not out there doing it so much, but part of this conversation in me is really calling me back to this part of myself and ourself to revitalize how we live it in the everyday as well as in the circle.
Mm-hmm. We've got lots of wonderful questions here, and there's a couple of about translating this to the virtual world. Mm-hmm. Is it metaphor? Is it invitation? The experience translates, but visually the circle flattens. The center point becomes hard to track. Is it visual? Where does center become in this Zoom environment? This is a question from Julie Portelli.
So I've seen people take a cell phone and prop it up looking at a candle, and then that becomes a participant. So that there is a space on the screen where the center is obvious and held. It may not be in the center of the frame, but it's always there amongst us. And that's very helpful. Also, to have people create between our own bodies and the flat screen we're talking to a little center point. So you can take a tiny little LED tea light and put it on your laptop without ruining your equipment. But it reminds you that that center is there. And I find myself, because we can't literally pass the talking piece to one another, oftentimes the host will say, please bring a talking piece to your computer with you. And I'll put that on my laptop so that I'm reminded over and over again of the center.
So I am not a person who loves online environments the most. But I am the first one to say it is stunning, the creativity that people have brought to bringing circle online. Mm-hmm. And certainly one of the things that the pandemic has given us is a whole other look at online worlds. And, just as a very tangible example, the nursing home where my mother was started introducing the ability for her to have a Zoom call with her 4 daughters. And it was a circle. Mm-hmm. And she began incredulous. Where are you? Are you out in the lobby? She couldn't understand this flat screen, but no, I give huge accolades also to our colleagues in the Circle Way who have taken the circle work online, because that's what's happening. And so a circle is round. It rolls into the next best opportunity.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I think we really are called to in the on-screen circle is a responsibility for holding ourselves to sacred space, because we're scattered in different, so many different areas. And in life intrudes, we see this where the cat tail suddenly goes through the screen, or the phone rings, or a dog barks, or whatever. And that's life. And yet we're here. we're here with one another. And I think the small breakout groups in larger settings has been a miracle for many, many people. And I mean, just look at this call that we have people from Australia and South Africa and Europe and across North America. And, we couldn't do this otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Can I come back to this idea of sacred space? And you mentioned the spirituality. What do you mean by that? How does circle become a sacred space?
Well, there is that phrase, when two or more of us are gathered in the Christian tradition in his name. And I think that really is the answer to your question, Diana. When two or more of us are gathered with the intention of honoring one another's humanity. And by honoring, I mean welcoming the fullness of who you are. I saw a question go by from a colleague of ours. Would you speak about shadow? And of course, parts of ourselves that we keep hidden, that we really don't want others to see, when the wholeness of us is invited to sit in circle, all those parts will come forward. Mm-hmm. And so I think I'm trying to be as tangible as I can in answering your question, Diana. But I believe that when people gather and they're listened to and they listen to others, that is what makes sacred space.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And I want to say that on the circleway.net, there are so many resources available, and that we, at the end of our active teaching phase, we just handed this over to this nonprofit, because the circle is really a ministry of sorts. It is when you're helping people remember how to call sacred space. That we didn't want, we needed it to sustain us, but it wasn't really a consulting practice for us. It was a way of helping a global community remember itself. And so we have a booklet on shadow and energetics, and a 2-page guideline to how you do this that's in 18 or 20 languages. And to just please go out there. Most of it is free.
Yeah.
And celebrate and look at who's there and participate in this. Don't be afraid to sit down and try this and practice it and keep doing it,
I so want to honor the two of you for the tremendous gift you gave. Mm-hmm. It is so radical to give things away. And it was deeply inspirational to us. And it's why we give everything away. We're following in your footsteps. So we really appreciate that. And I there's a question from Ange Coxon. Ange works with students, with younger people, and she'd like to know more about the Appreciation Council and idea. Can you just let us all know, particularly in the context of youth?
Yeah, it's so much fun to work with little kids because their filter is so much fresh, and
or even teens.
Or teens, to take something that's fun, like a little koosh ball as a talking piece, and to just toss it around a circle, a classroom, and whoever's holding it, 3 people get to say what they like about that child, or that child can toss it to another child saying, Dewana, what I like about you is your wonderful curly hair and big smile, and toss it across the room. Just like shake up the energy and have fun with it. Works great with teens as well. Or people can write slips of paper, like little Valentines, like 1-sentence Valentines that they deliver around the circle. It's a lot.
Yeah, the benefit of making a game out of it, if you will, besides changing the energy, is it helps us think about each other in appreciative ways. Mm-hmm. There probably needs to be a little bit of coaching before the koosh ball or something gets passed. tossed, but just to say one thing you can think about that you appreciate about that person, and then give a whole bunch of examples, because they're going, really, Roger? I don't appreciate anything about him. But of course you do if you think about it deeply enough. So
there's a question here from Lisa Magdalena about tips for inviting folks who are not predisposed to it. How do you get folks curious enough to try it?
Well, that's such a broad subject. Ooh, I mean, usually we're asking people from a certain population pool, whether it's a family, whether it's a school classroom. So I think I would answer her question from that standpoint. If you are interested in having a family member, teaching colleagues join you, then what would bring them to the table? What would make them curious? Now, in my own family, I gave the example, what's bringing people to this gathering is their love for Asti, the beloved grandmother. And so what I have a hard time answering when it's such a broad topic. It is, for some people, it's a scary idea if it's very formal and held tightly. But one of the things you said, Diana, which was very relevant, I think part of what's working in healing circles is it's held lightly. And so to get circles going in a group that you're interested in bringing it, think, all right, maybe it's a book group.
Or it's check-in.
There are plenty of book groups which could easily be morphed into circles, which would enable the comments to drop down to a whole other level. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and I think in business and also in families, we do a check-in, where we just say, before the football game, before dinner, before starting the meeting, which is whatever that's going to be, say, I just want to check in here. We've even done that in our neighborhood association, asking people to say their name, how long they've lived in the neighborhood, and one thing they like about living together in this way, and people will go, gosh, our annual meeting just went so much better. I have no idea why, and it's because we did the check-in. And I think check-in is a very powerful way of doing that. And you can do it without being elaborate in any way. And in business, we would say, we want to know why do you think you're at this meeting? What is one thing you need to get out of it? And one thing you're bringing. And people will, it's enough of an intellectual question. People can kind of go into their heads, but as it goes around, it really feeds the whole group.
I'm just going to ask one more question here, because I know Kira has some announcements at the end of our time, but you've talked about so many different uses for circle, and they range from just this, just a neighborhood meeting can go smoother to very deep, transformative healing work, regardless of what the healing is, whether it's a physical illness or whether it's an organizational rift or a societal trauma. But what has always struck with me was how you closed our first workshop. And you talked about love, and you talked about the love that comes through circle. Can you share more with everyone on that?
Well, love is the essence of everything. And I know I feel loved when people listen to me and appreciate me. And because circle brings both of those things in, we just finished this whole conversation about appreciation councils. Mm-hmm. So once people have been listened to and appreciated, they feel much more confident about coming forward and with love towards one another.
Mhm.
And isn't that a radical notion?
Well, I think love is sacred space, and
Mhm.
sacred space is love. And the notion that God is love, the divine is love, is the universality of all spiritual traditions.
Mhm.
So when we call in the circle and activate that space, that kind of universal love is always present in the room with us. And it is up to us then to activate it, to believe it, to relax into it, and acknowledge it, to be the mouth, the eyes, and the ears of that divine presence.
Christina and Ann, it has been such a delight to be with you. I am so glad that I've been able to share with everybody on this call the delight I get from our conversations. You have been so instrumental in inspiring the work that has come. And I just would like to end by letting everybody on the call know that Healing Circles Global has two great missions. One is to provide a place of support to anyone. Our coming together circles have completely taken off. There's 50 or 20 of them every single week. And although interestingly, the goal is to come together, we now have coming together circles for LGBTQ, for men, for women, for different age groups, for moms, for just what we're called to. We now have a circle starting for death and dying, and the place to have that kind of conversation. We have circles for grief. We have 9 circles for cancer. So if you have cancer, you can find a circle whenever you need one. We have circles for caregivers, and most importantly, in appreciation for the work that our essential workers and our nurses and our doctors and healthcare workers, we have circles for healthcare workers. But the other key thing is just the pleasure, the deep pleasure that we have in becoming hosts and guardians of these circles. So we have a training starting next week, next Thursday. And if you haven't had a chance yet to be trained, we welcome you in. As I said at the beginning, this is a fundraiser. If you can donate, anything is helpful. And I'm going to, with deep appreciation, thank Christina and Ann again and turn it over to Kira and the wonderful technical crew.
Thank you. And thank you for your work.
Yes, and I will add my thanks to the circle. Diana, Christina, and Ann, thank you for being with us and for sharing about how you hold circles and for modeling how you hold circles today. Diana Lindsay, Christina Baldwin, and Ann Linnea, thank you for being with us at the New School at Commonweal. See you next time, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks to all who listened.